The cold of the early morning cut like a razor. The streets of New York were nearly deserted, with only a few cars rushing by, leaving streaks of red and yellow lights on the asphalt, slick with a fine drizzle. Jake Sullivan shoved his hands into the pockets of his worn-out coat and let out a long sigh. The day had been exhausting, another double shift at the restaurant where he washed dishes. His muscles ached, his mind felt heavy, and he still had a long walk ahead to the tiny apartment he shared with a coworker. He picked up his pace, wanting nothing more than to get home and collapse into bed. But then, something on the ground caught his attention. Amid the damp glow of the sidewalks and the yellowish streetlights, there was something dark, a small object that stood out against the concrete around it. It was a black leather wallet. Jake stopped and glanced around. There was no one nearby. Hesitantly, he picked it up and opened it. His eyes widened at what he saw inside. $100 bills. Lots of them. Dozens. His heart pounded. That was more money than he had ever held at one time in his entire life. His hands trembled. He looked around again, half expecting someone to appear to say it was all a prank. But it wasn't. It was real. And then, the big question took over his mind. What was he going to do with it? Before we continue, if you love inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found a wallet full of cash? Jake stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the wallet in his hands. The cold of the early morning didn't matter as much anymore. His heart was racing, and his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed money. Badly. Rent was overdue, bills were piling up, and his minimum wage job barely covered the basics. Just that week, he'd had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. And now, fate seemed to be handing him an unexpected way out. Maybe this is a sign, he thought. Maybe it was his chance to finally turn his life around. He could pay off all his debts, buy new clothes, leave that exhausting job. He could even start over. But then, a thought cut through his mind like a sharp blade. What if it were my money? What if I were the one who lost all this? He looked at the wallet again. Inside, along with the cash, there was an ID. An elderly man named Richard Thompson. The name didn't ring a bell, but the photo showed a man with a tired yet kind expression. The face of someone who could have been his grandfather. Jake felt a knot in his stomach. He knew what he had to do. But that didn't make the decision any easier. He sighed, closed his eyes, and pressed the wallet against his chest. Give it back or keep the money? He glanced around once more. No one was watching. The choice was entirely his. Finally, Jake took a deep breath and muttered to himself, "All right, let's do the right thing." He pulled out the ID and read the address. Richard lived in the Upper East Side, a wealthy neighborhood, a world away from Jake's reality. That kind of money probably wouldn't even make a dent in a man like him. But what if it did? What if this money was crucial for something important? A sudden determination rose within Jake. No matter the circumstances, he didn't want to live with the weight of having stolen something that wasn't his. So he tucked the wallet into his coat pocket and, with one last glance at the empty street, decided that at sunrise he would find Richard Thompson and return everything. Little did he know, that decision would change his life forever. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon when Jake boarded the subway to the Upper East Side. Everything around him felt completely different from what he was used to. He stepped out of the station and walked along tree-lined streets flanked by towering buildings with grand lobbies and immaculate facades. Here, everything seemed cleaner, more organized, more out of reach for someone like him. As he walked, he felt the wallet in his coat pocket like a weight. Temptation still whispered in the back of his mind. He could just turn around, pretend he had never found anything. After all, no one knew. But he knew. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. When he reached the address on the ID, he stopped in front of an elegant building. The doorman eyed him with a neutral yet assessing expression. Jake knew that his worn-out clothes instantly marked him as someone who didn't belong in this world. "Can I help you?" the doorman asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake took a deep breath and answered, "I'm looking for Mr. Richard Thompson. I found something that belongs to him." The man studied Jake for a moment before picking up the phone and dialing an internal number. "Mr. Thompson, there's a young man here at the front desk who says he has something of yours. Would you like to see him?" The response was quick and unexpected. "Send him up." The doorman hung up and looked at Jake. "Apartment 12B, elevator to the right." Jake nodded, but inside, his heart was racing. What was he even doing here? A guy like him, who could barely afford rent, about to step into one of the most expensive apartments in the city. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 12th floor. As the doors closed, he felt that this wasn't just any ordinary encounter. The elevator ascended silently, and with each passing floor, Jake's chest tightened. What was he going to say? How would this man react? He had no idea what to expect. All he knew was that he was about to meet someone who, in some way, might change his life. When the doors slid open on the 12th floor, Jake found himself in an elegant hallway, with plush carpeting and soft lighting illuminating the numbered doors. He walked up to 12B, took a deep breath, and pressed the doorbell. Seconds later, the door opened, and Richard Thompson stood before him. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, but he still carried himself with dignity, his sharp blue eyes scanning Jake with curiosity. He wore a gray wool sweater and held a well-crafted wooden cane, but his expression wasn't stern. There was kindness in it. "You must be the young man who found my wallet," Richard said, his voice deep but calm. Jake swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. I found it on the sidewalk last night. There was a lot of money inside, so I figured the right thing to do was to bring it back." He pulled the wallet from his coat pocket and handed it over. For a brief moment, Richard just looked at it. Then, with an almost imperceptible smile, he took it and opened it. The bills were still there, untouched. The old man lifted his gaze to Jake and said something he wasn't expecting. "You're a very honest young man. Do you know how many people would actually return this?" Jake hesitated. "Probably not many." Richard gave a slight smile and nodded. "Come in, please. I'd like to offer you a cup of coffee." Jake was surprised by the invitation. He didn't want to impose, but he also felt like this moment was bigger than he had imagined. So, he accepted. As he stepped inside the apartment, he was taken aback. The place was luxurious, but not in a flashy way. Solid wood bookshelves lined the walls, filled with books. There were antique paintings and a plush rug covering the floor. It felt warm, lived in. Richard walked slowly toward the kitchen, motioning for Jake to sit in one of the comfortable chairs in the living room. "I'll make some coffee. But first, tell me something." He paused, looking directly at the young man. "What made you return this wallet?" Jake took a deep breath. He could have given a simple answer, but the truth ran deeper than that. I've been through some really tough times, Mr. Thompson. I know what it's like to have nothing. But in the end, I figured this money might be a lot more important to you than to me. And above all, I wanted to sleep with a clear conscience." Richard was silent for a moment. His expression was unreadable. But then, he nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I like that. A lot of people in your position would have made a different choice. But you did the right thing. And you know, maybe this will change everything for you." Jake didn't quite understand what that meant, but he felt that this conversation carried a different weight in his life. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room as Richard Thompson moved slowly through the kitchen, preparing 2 cups. There was something serene about him, a calmness that contrasted with the nervous tension Jake felt. The young man was anxious, unsure why this meeting felt so significant. Richard placed a cup of coffee in front of Jake and sat across from him, clasping his hands together on the table. "So, tell me a little about yourself, kid. What's your name?" "Jake, sir. Jake Sullivan." "And what do you do for a living, Jake?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I wash dishes at a restaurant downtown. It's nothing special, but it covers what it can." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And is that your dream?" Jake let out a humorless chuckle. "My dream? My dream was to be an architect. I've always loved drawing, creating things. But life has a strange way of pulling us away from what we want, doesn't it?" The old man was silent for a few seconds, processing every word. Then he took a sip of his coffee and finally spoke. "You know, Jake, I'm a businessman. Or at least I was. I had my time chasing deals, building an empire, but at some point, You realize that none of it matters as much as the people you meet along the way. Jake simply listened, unsure of where this was going. Throughout my life, I've met a lot of talented people, Richard continued. But do you know what separates those who actually make it from those who give up? What? Jake asked, genuinely curious. Richard pointed at him. Integrity. Talent can be developed. Experience can be gained. But character? That's rare. And you've shown me that you have something money can't buy. Jake lowered his gaze, unsure of what to say. He had never thought that something as simple as returning a lost wallet could mean so much to someone. And that's why, Richard went on, leaning slightly forward, I want to make you an offer. Jake's eyes widened. An offer? What could this man possibly want from him? I have some contacts in the architecture field, friends who could help you get on the right path. But before anything else, I need to know, if you had a real chance to change your life, would you take it? Jake's heart pounded in his chest. Was this real? He felt a nervous excitement growing inside him, a mix of hope and fear. Fate was handing him an opportunity he had never even dared to dream of. Swallowing hard, he looked Richard straight in the eyes and asked, Mr. Thompson, what exactly do you have in mind? Richard smiled, as if he had been waiting for that very question. Oh, my boy. You have no idea. Silence hung between them for a moment, broken only by the soft clinking of Richard's spoon as he stirred his coffee. Jake felt that something big was about to happen, but he didn't know exactly what. The offer felt almost too good to be true. You said you wanted to be an architect, right? Richard asked, his gaze sharp. Jake nodded. I've always loved designing, drafting projects, but I never had the chance to study. College is expensive, and I can barely afford rent. Richard studied him carefully, as if every word Jake spoke was a piece of a puzzle he was trying to solve. The question isn't what you haven't had until now, he said, leaning in slightly. It's what you're willing to do moving forward. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. What do you mean by that? Richard took another sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable, then smiled slightly. I've helped a lot of talented people find their way. But before anything else, I need to know if you truly deserve this chance. Jake felt his adrenaline spike. Was this a test? What do you mean? Richard rested his elbows on the table and intertwined his fingers. I want you to work for me for a while. Nothing extravagant, but enough for me to see if you have discipline, commitment, and most importantly, if you hold on to the values you showed today. If you pass my test, I will personally help you get into architecture school. Jake's heart pounded. Was this really happening? He needed a few seconds to process what he had just heard. I don't know what to say. Just say whether you accept or not. Jake bit his lip. He barely knew this man, had no idea what his true intentions were. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that this was the biggest opportunity of his life. He had spent years believing that dreams were out of reach. And now, a complete stranger was offering him exactly what he had always wanted. Swallowing hard, he took a deep breath and looked Richard straight in the eyes. I accept. Richard smiled, satisfied. Excellent. Then be here tomorrow morning. Let's see what you're made of, kid. Jake left the apartment feeling like something inside him had shifted. Fate had just opened a door for him. And now, everything depended on what he did next. The alarm rang at 6 a.m. Jake had barely slept. Excitement and nervousness had kept him up all night, imagining what awaited him. He had never had an opportunity like this before. Everything felt surreal. A simple act of honesty had put in his path a man who could change his life. He put on the best clothes he owned, a plain blue shirt and a pair of jeans without rips, and took the subway back to the Upper East Side. When he arrived at Richard's building, the doorman seemed to recognize him. Mr. Thompson is expecting you, he said, letting Jake through without hesitation. Jake stepped into the elevator, his heart racing. He had no idea what to expect from the day ahead. Would he be organizing papers? Fetching coffee? Or was Richard testing him in a completely different way? When he knocked on the apartment door, it opened almost immediately. Richard was standing there, dressed in a beige sweater and dress pants. Punctual. I like that, the older man said, observing Jake. Come on, we have a long day ahead of us. Jake stepped inside, but to his surprise, Richard didn't lead him into the apartment. Instead, they left together and took a taxi to an unknown location. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Richard smirked slightly, as if amused by the question. "You said you wanted to be an architect. It's time to see what that really means." The taxi stopped in front of a massive construction site. Buildings in the early stages of development, scaffolding everywhere, workers in hard hats moving between stacks of concrete blocks. Jake's eyes widened. He had never seen a construction site up close before. "Let's go," Richard said as he stepped out of the car. Jake followed him, trying to take it all in. The noise of the machines, the smell of fresh cement, the mingling voices of the workers. This was the beating heart of architecture, the place where ideas left the drawing board and became reality. Richard led him to a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a reflective vest and holding a clipboard. "This is Mark," Richard introduced. "He's the site supervisor, and for now, he'll be your boss." Jake blinked, confused. "My boss?" Mark chuckled, clearly entertained, and handed Jake a pair of gloves and a hard hat. "Welcome to the job, kid." Jake looked at Richard, trying to understand. You thought you'd start in an office, designing buildings?" Richard interrupted, crossing his arms. "If you want to be an architect, you need to understand every step of construction. And that starts here, on the ground level." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had never done anything like this before, but at the same time, he knew this was his shot. He took the hard hat, put on the gloves, and looked at Mark. "What do I need to do?" Mark gave a satisfied grin. "We'll start with the basics. You'll carry materials, help the masons, and learn how everything works." Jake took a deep breath. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the first door opening toward his dream. He adjusted his hard hat firmly on his head and said, "I'm ready." From a distance, Richard watched, nodding with a subtle smile. Jake's first day on the job was harder than he had imagined. Under the scorching morning sun, he carried heavy cement bags, stacked bricks, and hauled tools back and forth. His body ached. His muscles, unused to such strain, screamed with exhaustion. Mark, the supervisor, kept a close eye on him, not giving him a moment to rest. "Come on, kid. Do you want to be an architect or not?" he would say with every new task. Jake gritted his teeth and kept going. Did he want to quit? Absolutely. The work was tough, dirty, and completely different from the romanticized vision he had of architecture. But he also knew this was his only shot. For hours, he followed orders, got covered in dust and cement, and listened to the workers' conversations around him. These men knew more about construction than any book could ever teach. They talked about foundations, structures, and the perfect fitting of materials. And Jake began to realize that every detail mattered. Then, something happened. While carrying a few wooden planks, he overheard two masons arguing over a problem. "If we place this pillar here, we're going to have issues with weight distribution," one of them said. "But we don't have another option," the other replied. "The project plans require this alignment." Curious, Jake stepped closer. He looked at the space in question and for the first time saw beyond the mess of cement and scaffolding. He saw the structure, the forces at play, the spatial limitations. Without thinking too much, he spoke up. "What if you used an extra diagonal support beam to redistribute the load to the side? That might help prevent future cracks." The two workers turned to him, surprised. "You know about structural support?" one of them asked. Jake hesitated. "Not really, I just thought it might work." The men exchanged glances, and then one of them gave a small smile. "You know what? That might actually work. Let's test it." Mark, who had been watching from a distance, nodded toward Richard, who stood nearby. "The kid's got a knack for this," Mark said. Richard smiled, pleased. "I knew it." Jake had no idea, but that small moment was a turning point. His first glimpse of what it truly meant to think like an architect. That night, he went home completely exhausted, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The following days were grueling but eye-opening. Jake continued working at the construction site, learning from the workers, observing every detail of the build, and absorbing as much knowledge as he could. But the most surprising thing was how he started earning respect. At first, Many doubted him, a skinny kid with no experience who looked lost among all the concrete and steel. But over time, Jake proved himself. He asked questions, learned quickly, and most importantly, showed a genuine passion for what he was doing. Richard Thompson kept watching him from a distance. "What do you think of him?" he asked Mark after a few days. "He's got a future. He's not afraid of hard work, and he sees solutions where others see problems." "Exactly what I was hoping for," Richard smiled. That afternoon, as Jake was finishing another long shift, Richard called him over for coffee at the diner next to the construction site. "So, how's it going?" the older man asked. Jake let out a deep sigh, feeling every muscle in his body ache. "I've never worked this hard in my life, but I'm learning things I never even imagined." Richard took a sip of his coffee and crossed his arms. "You know, Jake, I didn't bring you here just to see if you could handle the workload. I wanted to see if you really wanted this." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "You've proven you have discipline, curiosity, and integrity. Now it's time for the next step." Jake looked at him, confused. "Next step?" Richard smiled and pulled an envelope from his pocket. "A scholarship for the best architecture school in the city." Jake's eyes widened. His heart stopped for a moment. What? You worked hard. You showed you want to learn, that you have talent, and that you deserve this chance. So here it is. If you want it, from now on, you can study architecture for real." Jake stared at the envelope in his hands, unable to process what was happening. He had never dreamed something like this could happen to him. "But, Mr. Thompson, this is too much. I don't even know how to thank you." Richard smiled. "You don't need to thank me. Just make it count." Jake's eyes welled up with tears. For the first time in his life, he felt like the impossible was within his reach, and he would do everything not to waste this chance. He held the envelope in his trembling hands. It was proof that his life was about to change forever. He looked at Richard, still in disbelief. I don't even know what to say. This feels like a dream." Richard gave him a small smile. "Then turn that dream into reality, Jake. But remember one thing. Success isn't just about talent. It's about effort, discipline, and most importantly, character. And you've shown you have all of that." Richard's words echoed deep inside him. Jake realized that his decision to return the wallet hadn't just changed a stranger's day, it had completely changed his own destiny. From a young man with no prospects, washing dishes to survive, he now held in his hands the opportunity to study what he had always dreamed of. But more than that, he learned that honesty and integrity always find their way back. Time passed. Jake studied with dedication, faced challenges, and learned more than he had ever imagined. The course wasn't easy, but he was determined to honor the chance he had been given. And then, one day, in a packed university auditorium, he received his architecture degree. Richard was there, sitting in the audience, watching with quiet pride. He knew he had bet on the right young man. After the ceremony, Jake approached him, holding his diploma, his eyes shining with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you." Richard smiled and shook his head. "Yes, you would. I just gave you a little push. The rest? That was all you." Jake took a deep breath and extended his hand toward Richard. But instead of a handshake, the old businessman pulled him into a hug. "Now go and build something that makes a difference in the world, Jake." And in that moment, Jake knew his journey was only beginning, because a single choice can change everything.